Hello everyone, I'm Kaskop and welcome to Dungeon Wright, the place where I will be sharing my personal tips and tricks when creating content for role-playing games. In this first episode, I will be showing you how I create a forest team battle map from scratch. Well, actually I'll be creating 6 interlinked battle maps, so I can showcase creating a larger amount of elements in one video. Before we start though, I would like to touch briefly upon what I call the pirate law. These are actions you should not be afraid to fall back on when creating your own content, and they basically boil down to these 3 things: look, steal, and cheat. I will elaborate on each of these 3 throughout the video, but let's kick things off with the first one on the list: look. When creating quality content, it's important for you to stimulate your senses, to go look for things that inspire you. Pinterest, in my opinion, is a great place for you to accumulate such content. I'm not just talking about quality artwork you're aspiring to be able to match one day, but everything that relates to what you're trying to create at the time. For example, in my case, I was looking to create random forest battle maps people could use in their games. When normally I might have very specific designs for my work, here I had a lot of leeway. So what I did for this project is search for forest-related images on Google and gather them in a single Pinterest board. There were a couple of elements I knew I wanted to include, like rivers, bridges, and various types of campsites that could either be used by players or be populated by NPCs designed by a GM. Outside of that, I would just Google a jumble of keywords like forest, waterfall, rocky, swamp, anything that felt like it could be part of the scene I had in mind. Now, bearing in mind I was looking for actual photos, not artwork someone had created by hand. The reason for this is because there is a time for getting inspired and figuring out new techniques, but when creating your own work, you should refrain from guiding your hand based on their designs. So now that we found our inspiration, let's get to the second part of the pirate law: steal. So what you see here is a simple baseline grid I had drawn up with the line tool, and the first rough draft of this particular project. But before I move on, let me walk you what I was trying to achieve here. Like I said before, I wanted to create 6 different battles. Although each of them would have a different focal point, I wanted them to be interconnected and have specific elements run from one map to the next. I wanted a small brook, a waterfall, and a river with a bridge, making them more central in some of my drawings, but not all of them. The focal points I had created from the photos I had found earlier, adapting them in my work to make them useful for the players in combat or for the GMs to tell a story. It's important to be unafraid to use these references when creating work. Don't just copy them mindlessly, but transform them and make them fit into the idea you're trying to bring to life. Once I have everything set up and I'm happy with my rough, I start to work on a better sketch. One that will help me find direction in the line work for my final draft. It helps my brain try to figure out where certain pieces fit in the design, as I'm not focused on getting my line work just perfect yet. It will also help me figure out proportions of specific objects in relation to others. Creating a second sketch will also help me focus on getting the artwork in line with the base grid. Not just making sure the players and GM have room to act, but also make it easier for them to understand the scale of their surroundings. Occasionally zooming in and out will help you keep an eye on the bigger picture as well. Once we start on the final draft, we want to be able to keep our focus much closer to detail. Once we're finished with the final sketch, I can start working on the final version of my line art. This is where the final rule of the pirate law comes into place: cheat. Cheating is basically using the software you're working with to your advantage. It's great when you can say you drew every line by hand, but it's better to focus that dedication elsewhere and actually get projects finished in due time. So as we get started on the final draft, I will kick things off with drawing trees for my forest. First trick is using simple shapes as your base of your design. I will use these to draw 5 trees with minor variations, using my references to guide my hand. Deciding early on what type of forest you want to design will help you figure out how many variations you want. I will be sticking close to about a 10 feet diameter for each of my trees. But you can definitely play around with this and make it much livelier. Now once I've finished with my trees, I delete the shapes and start color coding each unique tree. Then I copy those original trees and keep them separate in a folder, as a backup in case I make a mistake. Then I just start copying them over and over, rotating and perhaps even flipping them over to make them look more distinct from one another, using my sketch as a reference for where to put the trees. Once I've created bigger clusters of these trees, I will use the clusters to make the process even easier. You can definitely draw each of these trees individually, but no one in their right mind will be focused on details like that when playing the game. Now, what I normally do when creating an asset, an object that I will use over and over again in my drawing, is create a smart object of that asset. Something I actually forgot to do here. Creating a smart object of an asset will make sure you don't lose quality of the object. These trees will serve as an excellent example of why you should do this, because if you look closely, you will see them lose their crispness over time. Once I have put the forest in Forest Team Battlemap, I get to working on minor details on the map. Both unique details like this fairy circle at the edge of the map, and basic things like fallen branches, rocks, grass. Minor details should be pretty simple to get right in a couple of tries. But working on bigger elements like the split rock requires a bit more attention. Another tip is to flip drawings when you feel like there's something off about them. It will help you figure out what exactly is straining your eye. For this element, I just wanted to move on and I decided to just duplicate one half and flip it over. Yet another easy cheat for when you're feeling stuck. You might have noticed I spent a lot of time working on details like the grass in this project. Depending on the project, I might make assets of clusters of grass and duplicate them. I will actually be doing this a bit further into the project, but for this map I decided to draw most of the grass by hand. There are also multiple ways to create elevation in your work. A lot of map makers do this by drawing two lines and connecting them with triangles to make it seem like a rocky surface. I have my own technique of creating curved lines and adding minor details to give it that rocky texture. Again, using references and figuring out how you translate real objects into a drawing will help you find your own drawing style. When drawing buildings or locales like this druidic circle of stones, I like to give them a third dimension. I feel it will help players get a better sense of their surroundings, help them understand what might provide cover or where entrances are located. Generally, when I do this, I center the vanishing point of my objects in the center of each separate room. In this example, there's only one location where I use the vanishing point in this context, but when I have multiple rooms, I use a separate vanishing point for each one. I found that in my type of drawings it feels more natural when compared to the other options, like using a single vanishing point. You might discover that something else works better for yours, so definitely give them all a whirl. You might have also noticed while I'm doing all of this, is that I'm only using one brush for the entire drawing. Later on you will actually see that I even use this brush for the coloring as well. Minor details like this can make your work feel distinct from others. Definitely if you use the same technique for each of your drawings. On the plus side, it helps me perfect the technique, but on the negative side, it keeps me from learning new tricks. Something I try to do when I find the time to practice, but it's always difficult to find a good balance between the two. Think ahead of what you're trying to accomplish with your work, and then stick to it as you go along. Drawing this campfire, you will see me pull out my old using a simple shape as a base trick again. I'm doing the same thing for these sleeping bags. Using simple shapes will help you create useful assets you can use over and over again. I did move a bit too quickly when creating these bags though, not measuring them properly as I created the first one. A mistake I will fix later on in the process, by simply adjusting the scale. Working on this tutorial, you can see that I also switch my sketch on and off in the background as I finish minor details like the grass. When there's too much clutter on the screen, it can be difficult to get a feel for how much detail is too much and how much is too little. You can see I like a lot of detail, creating more work than is perhaps necessary, but when I feel like something works for a drawing, I try to stick with it until the bitter end. Coming up is another one of my favorite techniques when it comes to cheating, creating roads or stone tiles. I do this by creating a cluster of them first and then making them into a smart object, creating my asset. I flip the asset and then put it underneath and then copy both of those to fill the basic layout of my road. Then I just fill in the gaps to hide the cheat. Let's fast forward a bit here. Getting to the campsite, you can see me try to figure out the vanishing point for this area. Like I mentioned before, some cases will require you to mix things up a bit. Or like when I'm creating those smaller tents, to take the shortcut. Definitely try the shortcut first and see if it works out or not. It's not just drawing the third dimension that makes certain objects pop up from your canvas though. You can also use the baseline grid and leg thereof to make certain objects pop. You can do this by using the mask on your grid and then using black coloring to erase the grid on any object that you want to give some height. To make this process much easier, you can use the magic wand. By making a selection of all the empty space between the trees on the tree layer, refining those edges, and then inverting the selection. Once you fill up that selection with black coloring, it will make all the trees pop on the map instantly. Anything else you would like to accentuate by giving it some dimension, you just paint in with your brush. You can either do it by hand or selecting the area and then using a paint bucket. Whatever works best for you. After that, we move on to the final stage of our work, and that is coloring. Now, I'm not great at coloring, I never have been, so I always had to resort to simple tricks to help me figure out what works. I either use palettes I find online, or try to figure out how other people have used it in pieces of the art that I found online. There are a bunch of different techniques I use, but it generally ends up with a bit of an experiment in combination with tools provided by the software that I use. I start off with a base color, and then I use the same masking technique to color in as much as possible with minor effort. Using these masks can also come in handy later when you need to do some touching up. You can just copy them and paste them on whatever layer you're working on. After using these simple techniques, I just move on to coloring in large patches to figure out which colors work well together. I do this based on the colors I've been collecting and matching earlier on my little swatch board in the top corner. Using the mask to color in trees works just great in this instance. Giving each tree a unique color has been made super easy. Once I have all my colors in play, I start using the software to figure out what colors need to be adjusted somewhat. Hue saturation is definitely one of my favorite filters for this job. Another great trick is to multiply a specific color you had in mind for the artwork you're working on. Then when you tweak the colors, you can start going into details. Fixing up masks you use is always a great first step, especially ones you're planning to use over and over. After that, it's just putting in the work and make sure everything looks great. Another great tip for when you've finished up all the detail is duplicating the finished layers and throwing another hue saturation effect on top. Using a mask, you can add some more color to the entire work, adding more dimension to the map. After that, we use the same technique to add shadow. This will help you translate height into something visible on the map. The tree line, the druidic circle, the rocky terrain, the hillside, the bridge, and the tents. These are the finishing touches that really make the entire map come to life. Once you're finished, you can finally export your artwork and enjoy the work you've put in. Next step is getting it into your game and letting your players explore your creation. Well, that's it for me, folks. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on making a battle map. If you did, feel free to subscribe to my channel for more. And if you really want to help me create more of these, you can always pitch in on my Patreon. All links are provided below in the doobly-doo. Until next time.